I said, you remember, we were quoting the in Parshat Lech Lecha, the aspect of Brit Milah, and then he goes on to tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't perform it, because there is also the aspect of Brit Milah, and it was accomplished. The reason why Moshe Rabbeinu did not, because he knew the task that lied ahead, and that was, he was going to have to regain control and be master of the universe, of which at that time the Egyptians were in total control with their negative energy intelligence, total control of the entire human race, as the Zohar mentions, in that middle kingdom, and that everyone fell under the influence and dominion of the Egyptian. And before he could create any balance or any semblance of balance in this universe, placing it back into a par, he knew that he would have to confront the energy intelligence when it became manifested. This negative energy intelligence referred to as the Olah. Moshe just has to make a change. Okay. Now, the Zohar mentioned that before the Jew can have dominion over the negative intelligence called the Sitra Achra or Satan or Satan, there is a requirement of the Brit, because if the Brit does not cut the Orlah at its root, then it becomes manifested, and then it's like everything else. Cutting out something rather than not permitting it to become manifest is the difference between no cancer and cancer that already has taken hold. Moshe Rabbeinu, like Rabbi Shimon, who followed in his footsteps, knew that if he was now coming, as the Zohar said, he was now coming in to make an attempt to take control over what I call the Dark Lord, who was Egypt. The actualization of that, was when it was already firmly entrenched in his own turf, and if he could now completely take, not only remove, but take this complete embodiment where his potential, remember when we do the Brit, we remove the potential. Does that mean we have now removed the Allah, the dominion of Satan in the world? No. For this particular individual, yes. Therefore, not to have, or not to enter into a kind of position of dilemma, that he become entrenched, we are required to cut him out right at the outset. Moshe Rabbeinu knew what was prepared for him. He was entering not into a physical encounter with the Egyptians. This was, in fact, as we discussed in Shemot last year, this entire encounter, the entire story of Exodus, actually took place before it happened. It took place on that metaphysical potential area. When the Jews left Egypt, it was only an actualization of what Moshe had already accomplished long before that day when the Jews left. The actualization took place. But, as we said in Bo El Paro, when God tells Moses, Bo El Paro, come to Pharaoh, and actually all of the Zohar and everyone else as a commentator raises the question, why does it say Bo El Paro? It just say Lech El Paro, go to Pharaoh. Why is he telling him come with me? He should go. And so in the absence of no understanding, they corrupted the translation, and it says, if I can quote, and you will again see a demonstration of how this important cosmic coded document has been so corrupted, because anyone who knows a little Hebrew knows that the word bo means come. And so in chapter 10, chapter 10, in Exodus, verse 1, it says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh." And that is a corruption. Because the word bo, there's no way of twisting that word into meaning come. And because of a lack of understanding of the text, you take the liberty of corrupting the meaning and say, "Go unto Pharaoh." All right? But we know that it meant, "Come with me." In other words, God, meaning that's the force. Come and let's do battle where the battle belongs, on the level of 99%, or the level of consciousness where the potential, where the seed lies. Because if you can eradicate, or at least create a dominion over evil on a metaphysical level, then the actualization will never take place. There will never be dominion of evil if you can deal with it on a metaphysical level, which is what Kabbalah is all about. Why treat the sickness? Why treat the symptoms when we are at least beginning to be provided with methods by which we can treat not the symptoms, which is what science is all about, but rather get into the potential, into the cause before the actualization. So, when Moshe, as the Zohar says, and this is the secret, now the Zohar is not that clear, and then when I said I did not know the answer to that question, only now did I myself put it together, by realizing that the Zohar brought that factor in, and just preceding the incident of Moses, he says, Brit accomplishes dominion over the evil force. And so for Moshe to be in a position that he can say he took the full manifestation, not the seed as we do in Brit Milah, but the full manifestation, and then eradicated it with its manifestation. So in other words, he took away the potential and the actualization both at the same time.
It makes it disappear, basically.
And so he dealt with the actualization. Because if you deal only with potential, you then can still have him come about again. Brit Milah only moves him from that area, but it doesn't mean the Satan is eradicated because we have made Brit Milah.
Check what we said in the morning. You boil the water, but the water disappeared, but it's still there.
But the water, the energy, intelligence of the water is still there. All right? Therefore, Moshe did not create and permitted that kind of environment, that kind of circumstance to arise, where then the Satan, which had become actualized in his son, now was prepared to take him into his clutches and even bring him to death, as the verse says. But this was the intent of Moshe. This was the intent of Moshe, and he needed Zipporah, which he explains there. He needed his wife. He needed his wife to perform the Malchut, to perform the actualization. Moshe performed it on that metaphysical level, but the actualization of removing that klipa, but the fact that she had done the Brit Milah at a later date, had it not been for Moshe, and that is the distinction I'm making between children whose Brit has been delayed, where it has become manifested. You would need someone like Moshe, or Moshe's teachings, if there are any, how you can eradicate the manifestation already and the actualization that has taken place where a Brit, where a circumcision has been delayed. That was the case of Moshe. It had been delayed, but there was with intent, so that it could become actualized, and then that actualization would be eradicated.
So basically, anybody who had delayed Brit is doomed, unless he studies something.
Not doomed. Now he has a problem. He is now more or less on the turf of Satan rather than...
So what is this thing that UK Love Cain wanted to kill him?
What's that?
Does this thing UK Love Cain wanted to kill him for it? So it was a mistake.
It was...
Well, precipitated the whole thing.
That's right. That's right.
What?
in the verse, what Ben is asking, since we're delving into this aspect with great detail, it says, Vayivkesheu Hashem vayvakesh hamito, and he sought to kill him. Now there you have the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the tetragrammaton, right? Which is the force, right? The force was out to kill Moses. That's the question that Ben raised.
Moses or his son?
No, Moses himself. Sure. The son was incidental because Moses was recognized on another level. I mean, if he was being sent now to perform, and it was only Moses who performed the Exodus, it was not the Jews. The Jews just displayed a little removal of their negativity, but there wasn't anything real positive that the Jew did. In fact, how do we know that? Because the minute, that luxurious dinner of fish wasn't really suitable, he said, let's get back to Egypt where we can have a good meal of fish, right?
If they haven't done their Pesach probably, how are we expected to do it?
Well, that's why they all died and came back again. So we're doing a good job of preserving the onslaught and the Exodus. How could we ever think of achieving anything? So we discussed that in our lecture, in our evening sessions on Mashiach, and I. For all intents and purposes, if Rabbi Akiva couldn't do it, and Moshe couldn't do it, and all of the giants who's around here today to be in a position, to accomplish what previous giants, previous people of spiritual, metaphysical stature couldn't accomplish. How could we hope to? But we have answered how that is possible. We have answered that.
He's also saying Baderech Bamalon, in the way in the hotel. Why it's important to mention in the hotel?
Not only that, why does he have? And it came to pass on the way at the lodging place. Why should it just say? And it didn't come on the way to the hotel. Why is he telling me about what's happening on the way to the hotel? Tell me the story. Where did it happen? In the hotel, right? Why do I need it in the hotel is what Chezi is raising. Why do I have to know where it happened? And what happens if it happened outside? I mean, it mustn't be in the hotel. It could happen anywhere. But it also said, but we can probably stay on these. Let's see, there's 3 verses. We probably spend a couple of years on it, but that's not what I want to do here tonight, right? What? Now we'll get back to the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The force works, and its intrinsic characteristic is to work in favor of positivity. However, we know what Aveira means, transgression. Aveira. Does it mean the word sin? No. Aveira, because there's so many other words for sin, avon, pesha, right? Now we have a new word, Aveira, also used to indicate transgression, sin. But Aveira comes from that simple word, avar. In other words, when we create a kind of short-circuitedness, what happens with the electricity? It was drawn into the bulb. Where does it go? Well, it goes into that little black space on the area surrounding where the electric current comes out. It's been passed over into the dark Lord, into the black Lord. What happened here was because the Satan had become manifested and actualized. He has then, what comes through that male sexual organ? We said, a powerful force. That powerful force is the force. And here, Satan was in control of the force because he was permitted to become manifest. He was now using that same force, like in a bulb. You have positive and negative, is that right? Is there a different kind of electrical current in the positive pole as there is in the negative pole? No. It's the same force that can operate in a positive way, and the same force that operates in a negative way. Is there any force in this world that is not governed by the force of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei? Nothing happens in this universe without the force. The only difference is how this force becomes actualized. Whether we, through Aveirot, pass it over and it becomes manifested in the dark side, or it becomes manifested in the white side. That's the only difference. But it is always the force that makes things move. Whether the Satan cannot exist, says the Zohar, only and provided we furnish him with his sustenance. How do we furnish the Dark Lord with his sustenance? Is by providing him with that energy with which we draw and pass it over to him. When we create a short-circuitedness, you create something called black, the Dark Lord. There he is at every bulb. Or, unfortunately, for most people, they can only see that situation occurring in the bulb. I mean, why do you have black around where the short-circuitedness occurred? Why black? Why anything? But that's what's indicated. That current has been passed over to the Dark Lord, and that's what happened over here. And therefore, it says that the force was being united to an extent. And in fact, that's the whole tikkun process where we draw it out. All right. So we understand to that extent of what Moshe was out to accomplish. In other words, he was actually acting as a double agent. He was permitting the Satan to believe that he's going to become his partner. They're going to operate together. Right? Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Vayivkesheu, and they met. But when they meet, that's when he can destroy him. But he permitted this meeting of Satan and Moshe. He permitted it, Moshe, so as to be able to provide or bring back dominion of the force over the Dark Lord, which was Pharaoh. Now we asked this whole aspect of klipot. What are they? What are they? And why do I want to? Obviously, I cannot touch base on all of the questions that I was hoping we would be able to deal with.
I have a question here. Moshe knew how to remove both of them, the potential and the actuals. That's what he did later on, because he wanted to meet the Satan. So did Abraham Avinu. He knew the same power. He could do the same thing in Ishmael after the age of 13. So he knew too. He was quite aware of it.
Well, I'm coming to that. First, I want to. I'm going to have to discuss that part because it's not that simple. There's a reason why he waited for. I mean, like when he was 13, but he was also 13 years later after the birth of Ishmael, when he became a father, right? And then something happened, and he then had a brit milah. Why does the Torah, or why did the Creator put Abraham into this particular sequence of events? He was 86, as we stated before, when he became the father of Ishmael. 13 years later, he had his name changed and had a brit milah. The purpose of which, okay? Okay, now you're starting to put together a lot of information, all right? Right. Now, getting back to the aspect of 86, what is the significance of 86? We know that's a clue. Elokim is also 86. You know, we have the tetragrammaton force, which is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? That's a pure energy force. And then, which never acts as a double agent. It's always in its intrinsic characteristic of a positive force. Elokim which also is a name of God. Aleph Lamed Ke Yud Mem is a name of God. And that numerically adds up to 86. And at the same time, we also notice that, like in the Kriyat Shema, we have an expression, Elohim Acherim. It is the evil side of Elohim. Elohim Acherim. Now, you never give an evil side to the force of the Tetragrammaton. The force of the Tetragrammaton, using the power of the Tetragrammaton, is only with the ability of drawing positive energy. But in Elohim, we call that a dual aspect, because it's in Malchut, whatever. Elohim is its numerical value is 86. Now, we asked, why do we have to know how old Abraham was? Remember? He was 86. And if he was 84, would it really affect anyone here how old he was? Of what significance? But we're being provided with clues, as I've always stated, for the benefit of our own mental and physical well-being. No other reason. God does not act in his mysterious ways. With our ignorance, it appears like he acts in his mysterious ways. But because we're ignorant, it's, like the little story I always tell about Mushka, right? The little Jew on this, and I'll repeat it for some of you again. There was always a Mushka in Russia. The big lords had these big estates, millions and millions of acres, and they had all the peasants working for them. And they always had a little Mushka. That's what was really Moshe. There was always a Jew on that estate. I don't know why they always managed that, but there was always a Jew. And so the Lord said, he's gone away. I'm going to make it brief. He's gone away for 3 weeks, and the peasants figured, well, this was an opportunity to really take advantage of Mushka, and they contrived a plan. They would intoxicate him and place him into the bed of the Lord, and so he would begin to feel he's the Lord, and so on and so forth. And they went through the whole procedure. He wakes up in the morning, and he's in the Lord's room, and he gets the feeling. And they keep playing this game with him. Until one day he goes into the forbidden room. Since he's the Lord, he's permitted to go into that forbidden room, and that forbidden room was the library. He walks into the library and sees all these books and opens up a book, and of course, not being an illiterate, he didn't know how to read. You didn't? All right? Because you're looking with, like, as if you've never heard it before, but you think I'm going to say it differently, right? Anyway, he's looking all around. He can't read it. Now he knows he's not the Lord. He must be Mushka, right? Because certainly the Lord knows how to read. Oh, not why would he have all these books here? But his ego says, but wait a second. I mean, you're going to give it all up now because you can't read a book? I mean, isn't that pretty stupid? And he finally came to the conclusion. You know what the conclusion was? It's a bluff. His Lord doesn't know how to read either. This is just to put on a show that everybody should think he knows how to read. But nobody knows how to read, right? So because we are ignorant, you see, then everybody is ignorant. And so whatever God does and all the chaos and holocaust and so on, it must be very mysterious. And in his mysterious ways, he knows why he's doing things the way he's doing it. We don't subscribe to that kind of reasoning, right? We want to know. And so we say all of these mysteries are being revealed in the age of Aquarius by Rabbi Shimon. He told us that in this age of Aquarius, the world will be full of knowledge. So, when it says he was 86, right? And that's when he gave birth to Yishmael. Now, on another occasion, we raised the question, if there was anything that we can say about the tribe of Yishmael, which includes most of the Muslims today and Arabs, they have this characteristic and attribute of being very hospitable. Can't take it away from them. They are very hospitable. What's that? Take you into their home, and they're very hospitable, right? And in fact, they're very insulted when, if they offer you food and you refuse. I mean, they don't know what that means. And that was his attribute. But the Zohar says, but this was the attribute of chesed of the klipa. Now, how could there be sharing as a klipa? So we already discussed that at great length, but briefly stated, we know how good parents demolish children, right? Give them the Mercedes as soon as they graduate, and, and never really should they have a care in their life. Why should they have to go through all the pains of growing up and all of the poverty that they had to succumb to, so the parent now is going to make it much better for the children, right? And he demolishes him with it. In other words, by chesed, you can ruin people by overextending chesed. That is that characteristic that is also contained. So therefore, the Zohar says, know that while Abraham represents chesed, there is also an offshoot, an extension of Abraham, which is chesed, but is called Ishmael. In other words, there's a bad side to that too. There's a bad side to that too. That bad side came because he was 86, meaning he had not as yet achieved the chesed consciousness that would come at age 99. The chesed consciousness was not Abraham, and therefore he was born when? Ishmael? At age 86. Because he was still not involved in that kind of chesed consciousness. Therefore, he had Yishmael, because that was the process that there should be, not only by the Arab, but it should be here in the United States, how we can destroy our children by being over-permissive and so on and so forth, for the sake of sharing, so to speak, for the sake of sharing. Therefore, when he achieved 13 years later, but at that point, he was born from Terah. He came from the seed of Terah, and whatever Terah was, we've already learned about that. There was a rebirth with his new name. We discussed that before too. With this rebirth now, at that point of a rebirth, there was a complete new Avraham, one of a pure chesed consciousness. And therefore, 13 years was when it was required. Well, you know why we have bar mitzvah. I don't want to dwell on that either, but you see how all of these things come together. It required 13 years because until the age of 13, he was not yet born with that facility, with that ability of a pure chesed consciousness, which we know bar mitzvah represents. Because every child is born first with a desire to receive for oneself alone, and it is only when he achieves bar mitzvah, age 13 by a male or 12 by a female, that this new consciousness called sharing, responsibility, restriction enters. And therefore, at that point, when he was overcome with this transformation, at that point he was ready for a new kind of equality, which was chesed, and therefore the brit was required, not before.
That's why Sarah, she got pregnant after 12 years.
No.
12 is
Yeah, that's right.
because a year later.
That's right, because she was only, with her, it had only got, that's right, she was a year younger. All right, okay. All right. No, we'll just pass that off. Okay. All right, therefore, what was indicated in this passage is to show us the significance of what Brit Milah meant and why it came when it came. Therefore, by a Jewish child, as opposed to an Arab child, the Arab has already a greater intrinsic characteristic to his plus of chesed. What's that? And therefore he could have the Brit at 13. But whereas we know the intrinsic characteristic of a Jew, how ugly that is from one point of view, and how it could be transformed into being something of a purified nature, but it's this kind of battle. Therefore, by a Jew, it was required that you've got to nip it in the bud, or not.
Too late it's going to be.
That's right. Okay?
It's going to ruin the
Now,
world at the age of 13. If we'll have to do it at the age of 13, forget it.
He would destroy the world. He would destroy the world. Not only could he not maintain balance and dominion over the Dark Lord, but he would be like Moshe. But Moshe had a thought in mind, and that was Moshe. But every Jew would be so noble as to be part and parcel and joining the forces with the Dark Lord.